Says Ben, what is your opinion on Andrew Tate's proposition that depression is just a safety crutch and an excuse when people fail at life?
I think that's largely a bunch of crap. I think depression is a chemical imbalance. I know people who have been depressed. I know people for whom antidepressants have been highly useful. Listen, do I think that it is possible to intervene with people who are suffering from depression sometimes, and then use use, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy to get them out of that spin, out of that funk? I think that's possible. I think that the rise in depression rates in the United States is an indicator of the loss of purpose broadly across American society that's happening. I'm writing a book on that right now. But does depression exist as a clinical condition? Absolutely, it exists as a clinical condition, and I don't think that I don't think that it's fair to folks to suggest that just toughen up and get over it. I think there are a lot of people who actually do need some chemical help.
Neurodiversity is a pretty new term, and I'm very grateful for it. It gets to something that is absolutely real and has been harder to discuss before it existed. That said, I'm not sure I have a perfect definition. It recognizes the fact that we are not singular, that we are not all identical, that we have a variation of brains, of connectivity, of aptitudes, of weaknesses, of blind spots, and of sensitivities, and of capabilities. People on the autism spectrum who are very functional, in my experience, tend to have extraordinary analytical skills, and also often, actually, insight into social interactions, so long as they are not the ones participating. And so you have, I've had a number of autistic students actually point out to me dynamics that were emerging in classrooms that I hadn't yet seen, and that once they were pointed out, I could see. And these are the same students who have a very hard time recognizing when it is or is not time to speak or get up or walk through the middle of a classroom and such. There are a number of ways to be neurodiverse. We have names for some conditions that actually represent ends of continuum. Dyslexia is a big one. These are going to sound like they're coming out of left field, but color blindness, left-handedness, in each of those cases, being what in evolutionary biology we call the non-dominant phenotype. So I'm a lefty. That's the one of those that I belong to as a group. And about 10% of people across all cultures that have been studied are left-handed. It's a persistent, stable, rare phenotype, which suggests that it's adaptive, that it's persistent, it's complex, and it provides the different wiring of the brain associated with being a left-hander, provides benefit in the social group in which left-handers show up. We can put together analyses for why being a left-hander might allow you to approach a physical problem differently that a right-hander would have a harder time solving, but the different wiring of the brain allows for different approaches as well. Similar with color blindness, that it might be really easy to say, well, okay, that just is going to give you some ability to see past color and to see patterns that aren't color-based, perhaps, but I suspect that there's wiring in the brain that is associated with color blindness that also allows for enhanced abilities that are different from those who are color-sighted. Dyslexia for sure, right? Dyslexia is obviously a very modern condition because writing is a very modern condition. So as an evolutionary biologist, when I say modern, I mean thousands of years. So dyslexia is modern in terms of thousands of years. And language was always about sound and never about writing until recently. And so the lessened ability, it's almost never an inability, but the lessened ability to process written symbols into meaning in your head looks to me like it's in trade-off relationship with the ability to engage in real time in speech. And that's not to say that all of us can't learn through practice to be better at any number of these skills, but that being born with what the world is calling a deficit is almost always going to exist in trade-off relationship with some often hidden strength.
Breaking the spell of negative emotions. Most of us let our negative emotions persist longer than is necessary. Becoming suddenly angry, we tend to stay angry, and this requires that we actively produce the feeling of anger. We do this by thinking about our reasons for being angry, recalling an insult, rehearsing what we should have said to our malefactor, and so forth. and yet we tend not to notice the mechanics of this process. Without continually resurrecting the feeling of anger, it is impossible to stay angry for more than a few moments. While I can't promise that meditation will keep you from ever again becoming angry, you can learn not to stay angry for very long. And when talking about the consequences of anger, the difference between moments and hours, or days, is impossible to exaggerate. Even without knowing how to meditate, most people have experienced having their negative states of mind suddenly interrupted. Imagine, for instance, that someone has made you very angry, and just as this mental state seems to have fully taken possession of your mind, you receive an important phone call that requires you to put on your best social face. Most people know what it's like to suddenly drop their negative state of mind and begin functioning in another mode. Of course, most then helplessly grow entangled with their negative emotions again at the next opportunity. Become sensitive to these interruptions in the continuity of your mental states. You are depressed, say, but you are suddenly moved to laughter by something you read. You are bored and impatient while sitting in traffic, but then are cheered by a phone call from a close friend. These are natural experiments in shifting mood. Notice that suddenly paying attention to something else, something that no longer supports your current emotion, allows for a new state of mind. Observe how quickly the clouds can part. These are genuine glimpses of freedom. The truth, however, is that you need not wait for some pleasant distraction to shift your mood. You can simply pay close attention to negative feelings themselves, without judgment or resistance. What is anger? Where do you feel it in your body? How is it arising in each moment? And what is it that is aware of the feeling itself? Investigating in this way, with mindfulness, you can discover that negative states of mind vanish all by themselves. Thinking is indispensable to us. It is essential for belief formation, planning, explicit learning, moral reasoning, and many other capacities that make us human. Thinking is the basis of every social relationship and cultural institution we have. It is also the foundation of science. But our habitual identification with thought, that is, our failure to recognize thoughts, as appearances in consciousness, is a primary source of human suffering. It also gives rise to the illusion that a separate self is living inside one's head. See if you can stop thinking for the next 60 seconds. You can notice your breath or listen to sounds, but do not let your attention be carried away by thought, any thought, even for an instant. Pause this book and give it a try. Some of you will be so distracted by thought as to imagine that you succeeded. In fact, beginning meditators often think that they are able to concentrate on a single object, such as the breath, for minutes at a time, only to report after days or weeks of intensive practice that their attention is now carried away by thought every few seconds. This is actually progress. It takes a certain degree of concentration to even notice how distracted you are. Even if your life depended on it, you could not spend a full minute free of thought. This is a remarkable fact about the human mind. We are capable of astonishing feats of understanding and creativity. We can endure almost any torment, but it is not within our power to simply stop talking to ourselves, whatever the stakes. It's not even in our power to recognize each thought as it arises in consciousness, without getting distracted every few seconds by one of them. Without significant training in meditation, remaining aware of anything for a full minute is just not in the cards. We spend our lives lost in thought. The question is, what should we make of this fact? In the West, the answer has been, not much. In the East, especially in contemplative traditions like those of Buddhism, being distracted by thought is understood to be the very wellspring of human suffering. From the contemplative point of view, being lost in thoughts of any kind, pleasant or unpleasant, is analogous to being asleep and dreaming. It's a mode of not knowing what is actually happening in the present moment. It's essentially a form of psychosis. Thoughts themselves are not a problem, but being identified with thought is. Taking oneself to be the thinker of one's thoughts, that is, not recognizing the present thought to be a transitory appearance in consciousness, is a delusion that produces nearly every species of human conflict and unhappiness. It doesn't matter if your mind is wandering over current problems in set theory or cancer research. If you are thinking without knowing you are thinking, you are confused about who and what you are. The practice of meditation is a method of breaking the spell of thought. However, in the beginning, you are unlikely to understand just how transformative this shift in attention can be. You will spend most of your time trying to meditate, or imagining that you are meditating, whether by focusing on your breathing or anything else, and failing for minutes or hours at a stretch. The first sign of progress will be noticing how distracted you are. But if you persist in your practice, you will eventually get a taste of real concentration and begin to see thoughts themselves as mere appearances arising in a wider field of consciousness. The 8th century Buddhist adept Vimalamitra described 3 stages of mastery in meditation and how thinking appears in each. The first is like meeting a person you already know. You simply recognize each thought as it arises in consciousness, without confusion. The second is like a snake tied in a knot. Each thought, whatever its content, simply unravels on its own. In the third, thoughts become like thieves entering an empty house. Even the possibility of being distracted has disappeared. Long before reaching this kind of stability in meditation, however, one can discover that the sense of self, the sense that there is a thinker behind one's thoughts, an experiencer amid the flow of experience, is an illusion. The feeling that we call I is itself the product of thought. Having an ego is what it feels like to be thinking without knowing that you are thinking. Consider the following train of thought, a version of which may have already passed through your mind. What is Harris going on about? I know I'm thinking. I'm thinking right now. What's the big deal? I'm thinking, and I know it. How is this a problem? How am I confused? I can think about anything I want. Watch, I'll picture the Eiffel Tower in my mind's eye right now. There it is. I did it. In what sense am I not the thinker of these thoughts? Thus is the knot of self tied. It isn't enough to know in the abstract that thoughts continually arise or that one is thinking at this moment, for such knowledge is itself mediated by thoughts that are arising unrecognized. It is the identification with these thoughts, that is, the failure to recognize them as they spontaneously appear in consciousness, that produces the feeling of I. One must be able to pay attention closely enough to glimpse what consciousness is like between thoughts, that is, prior to the arising of the next one. Consciousness does not feel like a self. Once one realizes this, the status of thoughts themselves, as transient expressions of consciousness, can be understood. What are we conscious of? We are conscious of the world. We are conscious of our bodies in the world. And we also imagine that we are conscious of ourselves within our bodies. After all, most of us don't feel merely identical to our bodies. We seem to be riding around inside our bodies. We feel like inner subjects that can use the body as a kind of object. This last impression is an illusion that can be dispelled. The selflessness of consciousness is in plain view in every present moment, and yet it remains difficult to see. This is not a paradox. Many things in our experience are right on the surface, but they require some training or technique to observe. Consider the optic blind spot. The optic nerve passes through the retina of each eye, creating a small region in each visual field where we are effectively blind. Many of us learned as children to perceive the subjective consequences of this less than ideal anatomy by drawing a small circle on a piece of paper, closing one eye, and then moving the paper into a position where the circle became invisible. No doubt most people in human history have been totally unaware of the optic blind spot. Even those of us who know about it go for decades without noticing it, and yet it is always there, right on the surface of experience. The absence of the self is also there to be noticed. As with the optic blind spot, the evidence is not far away or deep within, rather it is almost too close to be observed. For most people, experiencing the intrinsic selflessness of consciousness requires considerable training. It is, however, possible to notice that consciousness, that in you which is aware of your experience in this moment, does not feel like a self. It does not feel like I. What you are calling I is itself a feeling that arises among the contents of consciousness. Consciousness is prior to it, a mere witness of it, and therefore free of it in principle.
The first thing I would say is that if you're dealing with someone who's depressed and they're really depressed, you should try giving them antidepressants. Because if they die, you can't help them. Okay, so if you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. And one of the things I do with my clients all the time, especially if they're really in trouble, is to tell them, look, I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. So that's a simple answer. It's not relevant to what I already described, except that if you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. Apart from that, lots of the time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example. There's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Now, Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now, the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me and to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose. And this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell? I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it, pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion. Well, do you have any friends? So sometimes you see people who are depressed, they have no job, they have no friends, they have no intimate relationship, they have an additional health problem, and they have a drug and alcohol problem. My experience has been if you have 3 of those problems, it's almost impossible to help you. You're so deeply mired in chaos that you can't get out because you make progress on one front and one of the other problems pulls you down. So one of the things I tell people who are depressed is like, don't sacrifice your stability. Get a job, even if it's not the job you exactly want. Get a damn job, you need a job. Find some friends. Get out in the dating circuit. See if you can establish an intimate relationship. Put together some of the foundational items that are like pillars that your life rests on. Well, that's the practical thing to do. So that's one example with regards to depression. Well, the thing is, you don't just launch it on them, you know. You got to negotiate with the person. And you also got to teach them to negotiate with themselves. And this is something that's very useful to know. You know, you can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So, for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, you know, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, you know, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, okay, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, you know, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for, you know, like 72 hours straight. And if you do that, here's a little interesting thing you can do. And, you know, maybe this is little obligations you should clean up. And so what you do in a situation like that is you teach the person to negotiate with themselves. Say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You've got to have some aims. Whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional Your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend, you have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. I mean, people always assume they have to believe and then act, but sometimes that's true and lots of times it isn't. So the trick, if you're doing therapeutic work with somebody and you're helping them establish a structure, is to find out what they'll do. Now, if they want to get better, which is not a given, because there are often payoffs for not getting better. That's basically the payoffs of being a martyr, or maybe the payoffs of doing what your entirely pathological family members want you to do because they actually want you to fail. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. So, you know, this is another thing to know about in your own life. It's something I learned in part from reading the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's a great Russian philosopher and novelist. You know, he said, you can look at your life and you can see what isn't right about it. I mean, all you have to do is look. And then you can start to fix that. And the way you fix it is by noticing what you could, in fact, fix. You know, people are often trying to fix things they can't fix, which I would not recommend, because if you try to fix something you can't fix, you'll just ruin it. Like, you can find all sorts of undergraduates who are perfectly willing to restructure the, you know, the international economic system, who cannot keep their room clean. And there's actually a gap there, you know, and it's surprising that people don't actually notice. So I would say, if you pay attention, you can see things that you could fix. They yell at you. They really do. We even know how that happens. Let me give you an example. Because rooms are full of stories. And the stories have effects on you. So here's a classic experiment. So you take two groups of undergraduates, you bring them into your lab, and you give one group a multiple choice test that has a bunch of words in it that are associated with being old. And you give the other group the same multiple choice test, except the words are associated with being young. This is independent of the content of the test. It's just descriptions. And then you time the undergraduates as they walk back to the elevators. The ones who completed the multiple choice test that had more words associated with aging walk slower back to the elevators. And they don't know that. And they don't know they're doing it. And that study's been replicated in various forms many, many times. You're unbelievably sensitive to the story that your environment's telling you. Because your environment is not made out of objects. That's just wrong. Your environment is basically made out of something like tools and obstacles. You're a tool using creature, you're a tool perceiving creature. The things you, like if I take you out of this room and I say, well, what was in the room? You're not going to say, you know, random patterns in the carpet, because they're real. They're just as good an object as anything else. You're going to say chairs because you can sit on them, and you're going to say handrails because you can hold them. You're going to say stairs because you can walk down them. That's what you see, and that's what you interact with. And if you pay attention to your environment, which is you, by the way, extended, all of your experience is you. It will tell you all the time what you should do. All you have to do is do it. But then you have to decide if you want to do it. One of the things I've noticed about people, because I've wondered, once I started studying these mythological stories, and I got this idea about the fact that life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. With regards to meaning, I thought, well, people know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. And then I thought, well, oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay for being able to be completely useless. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?